obviously need to talk a little bit about what happened, all right? You got my email, my lengthy, long manifesto. I'm not going to say much more. I think that covers how I felt and what happened. I do need to say a few more things. One is, anytime you feel uncomfortable about a class or something that's happened because of me, because of another student, because of an outside force, you should feel free and encouraged to contact the university. And many of you did that. They sent emails to me, you sent emails to other people in the university system. I love that. Right? Now, obviously, I love it because you said very nice things about me. That made me feel better, right? So I appreciate that. Thank you. You said mean things about me and still went on to the thing. That's important, too. That's part of the process we have here. The university is going to probably contact you at some point and talk about what happened, too. I'm not the university. Yeah, I am the university. They pay me, right? But I'm not really the university. So they're going to probably contact you and want to talk more about that. They may send something to you and be like, hey, do you want to have like a time to meet and talk about it? And that's up to you if you want to take care of it. And then finally, I think this goes without saying, but apparently it doesn't. If I'm asking you to comment or have a question, you're talking only to one other person, and that's me. Not to each other. If you don't like something another student says, raise your hand afterwards, right? Like, hey, I don't like what that student said. Hey, I like what that student said. Hey, I want to associate with myself with that student. Hey, I just want to build off of something another student said. I don't really like what that student said. All of those are fair game, right? What's not fair game is to talk to each other, right? In a smaller class that's not a lecture but a seminar, there might be a way to do that. In a lecture, there's no way to do that. So let's not do that. Right? You don't like something a student says? Wait until that student's finished and then raise your hand and I'll call on you. And then finally, if you want to talk more about this, I'm going to refer back to the thing I just said earlier. The university would love to hear from you. There are multiple people in this university whose only job it is to hear from students. Hey, welcome. Come on in. If you want to talk more about it to me, please send me an email. Many of you did. If I didn't respond to every student who sent me an email because there was a lot of them, right? That's why I sent out my statement. If you feel like Professor Russell, you didn't really cover my specific point, send me another email and I'll respond to you specifically. And I'll happily do that. We can set up the time to talk. We can do it on Zoom. We can do it in office hours. PUBG is down on Tuesday afternoon evenings for maintenance. That's a great time. All right? It's like, I want to play. I can't. Crap. Oh, let's talk to students. Perfect. You know?
Is that one of the games you play?
It's one of many, unfortunately. It is a frightening addiction that I have to deal with.
You play World of Warships?
I don't play World of Warships.
It's a fun one.
I've heard good things about that. I have one like battle royale game, I'm check mark. I have one like let's build things and invade other countries, so I have civilization. And I have like a bunch of like you know, like those like kind of like survival Pols180 games, right? Like you build up, like I'm doing 7 Days to Die, I'm doing one other one, right? It's like there's too many of those. But I love post-apocalyptic, and I like building things, and so like, and my daughter's about to start playing Minecraft, so like we're gonna be fine. Right? And then usually there's one other one, and like right now, like the Starfield, right? Like they're kind of like, hey, it's Fallout, but it's in space, so there's that one. And like, if there's any more than that, I can't do my actual job, right? Things start falling apart, so that's enough for now. We'll try to get back to some of the stuff we didn't get to cover last time, and we'll fit it in somehow. But I want us to move on to today's lecture about water. Yes?
I'm sorry, really quick, because I'm getting ready to take notes, and I know you usually, when you're going through the lecture, you're usually like, this is, you might want to write this down.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I'm properly preparing myself for exams and things
Yes.
like that. So what is it that we're actually like looking for? Like, what is it that's important that I need to be taking notes on? I know, like, through the reading, through our lectures,
Yeah.
like.
That's a good question.
Thank you for asking.
I would say the exams are 80% lecture, 20% reading. Okay. What actually in lecture is covered? Everything. What's really important? Things I say more than once.
Could you like you don't need to write that down. And I'm like, I just wrote it down. I thought that was
When I
important.
say you don't need to write it down, I really do mean that. When I don't say it twice, but I say you don't need to write it down, you probably need to write that down. It's just probably not going to be as focused as if I say it more than once.
How do you feel about recording your lectures?
I'm totally fine with it.
Got it.
In fact, someone recorded us last time, and that's probably like the best thing that's ever happened in my entire life.
I was gonna say that.
That was probably the single best thing that ever happened. Other than my daughter being born, that was probably the single best thing that ever happened.
What, you fainted?
I did. Yes, and thank you to the student who did that. I sent them a thank you as well. They offered them. I did it. Also, a video that showed nothing. It was like it could have been something. I don't even know what that was, but I appreciate both of them. The audio was very good. So yes, if I say things, write it down. If I say you don't need to know it, cross it out, or just circle no need to know it. Maybe it's still important. Maybe you still like it. If I say it more than twice, underline it. Put a dinosaur next to it.
Exactly.
A unicorn star, whatever it takes. I'm not telling you how you make your special notes, right? That would be improper. I don't know you. I like to have ats when I write down, like from Star Wars. I like to put little ats next to me. Yeah.
Can you speak to the structure of the exam? Is it similar to that?
Multiple choice. Entirely multiple choice. They're not easy. You get extra points because they're not easy. How many extra points? I don't know. Depends on how well collectively you do. Ideally, if you study really, really hard and then throw a huge party for the rest of the class and then they don't do well on the test, you're in good shape. That'd be a weird situation. I don't think that's going to happen. What do you think about the structure of the class? Cool. So, talking about water, which is an important fact in California. An amazing state where most of the water falls where people don't live. We got plenty of water, but we don't have a lot of people in the areas where there's tons of water that falls. Bless you. This is a little unusual compared to other states on the East Coast, but it's very typical for the West Coast. And we'll get to that in a second. The reality is about 70% of all rain falls north of Sacramento. About 75% of the population of California is south of Sacramento. About 70% of all the rain that falls in California is north of Sacramento. About 75% of the rain of a population in California is below Sacramento. You don't need to know that. You said it twice. Yeah, I'm just messing with you. I'm just throwing you off. You asked the question. You're going to give me a brushback pitch? That's fine.
We're like,
I'm
oh, that's
in charge
really
of the
important.
math. That would be a weird thing to know.
Okay.
But I do want you to know that most of the water that falls in California falls in Northern California. But the vast majority of the water we use in California goes to crops and goes to people. Goes to crops and goes to people. Do all the people in California just live here? No, of course not. That's where most of them live. And are all the crops only grown in Central Valley? No. Those yummy strawberries are oftentimes along the coast. I've gone to Northern California and all these cows are like, this is pretty good. Right? Other things that happen in other areas too. Imperial Valley grows a whole bunch of stuff, right? You want winter lettuce, that's where you're getting it from, Imperial Valley. But what it means is the water is way up here and the need for the water is all over the state, so we have to move it. So the story of California water is a simple one. We're shipping water someplace else. And it's been a story for as long as we've had some sort of sophisticated civilization. There's a reason why most of the Indian tribes that were here were just hunter-gatherers in the north. That's where the water is. Most of the civilizations that were here, the Indian tribes that were here, they didn't practice fixed agriculture. There was a hand. Yeah?
Will we have to know on the test where the water is being exported to?
You will need to know that water falls in the north, goes to the Central Valley and south for population and agriculture. That's pretty basic. I think we're good with that. So, we ship water from the Colorado River. We ship water from the natural rivers that exist here in California. We store it in giant lakes that usually we've built from scratch. Yep. And then we ship it someplace else. Here's a statistic you should know for the test. Of all the water we use in California, of all the water humans use in California, humans use water in California, 80% of that water is for agriculture. There's other water humans don't use. But of all of the water that's used in California, 80% of it's for what?
Agriculture.
Agriculture.
Oh, the agriculture?
Agriculture. Overwhelmingly, the water we use in this state goes to agriculture. All right, I'm going to show you two versions of this a little bit later on. This is where it gets complicated. We don't have one giant system controlling water in the state. We have the federal government. We have the state government. We have local governments moving water around. Sometimes working together, oftentimes not. So we have these giant aqueducts that move water south, sometimes built by the state, sometimes built by the federal government, sometimes built by both, and they share it. But we also have in these green lines huge amounts of water moved around to other parts of the state that are not run by the state or federal government. In many cases because they were built before the state or federal government was moving water around in our state, and they add complexity. They add nuance. They add government difficulty. Yes?
Do the higher levels of government, can they overrule the lower levels of government when it comes to fighting about water?
I'd love to say yes, but it's complicated.
Okay.
Sometimes no.
Okay.
Right? Sometimes they're like, we have these guaranteed rights that exist, and you can't say anything.
Okay.
Some of the water rights are in the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, which is between the United States and Mexico ending the Mexican-American War.
Okay.
So it's like the federal government can't just say we're going to violate a treaty that we signed over 100 years ago.
Well, I mean, they do.
Other times they do violate a treaty that they signed over 100 years ago. Guarantee about what?
What did you say about the green line?
The green lines mean local jurisdiction. State, federal, local. State are the orange. All right. And I'm going to go through some examples of this in class today. I'm not going to expect you to know all of this, because that would be insane. I don't know all. Here's where there are two ways of thinking about water distribution I want you to know. Riparian versus prior appropriative water rights. These are two different ways that the government thinks about water. And when I mean government, I mean at the most basic level. It could be federal government, state level government. It's just simply government, a system of people in charge of us that make decisions for all of us. This is just simply water falling from the sky across the United States. You'll notice that the areas that have intense rain distribution tend to be on the East Coast. And as you move from east to west, it gets drier and drier and drier. Yeah, up in the Pacific Northwest, it's super wet. We're not there, right? They're awesome, but we're not there. A little bit of that's in California, but we're not there. We also know that the people who showed up in ships tended to first land on the East Coast. In places like England and France and Holland, where most of the people who show up in ships were, they tend to practice a form of water policy, of water rights, called riparian water rights. Riparian water rights. England, France, Germany, Holland. Riparian water rights simply just says water rights are kind of just like a normal part of owning property. You have a piece of property next to a river, you have some claim on that river's water rights. You have a piece of property next to a lake, you have some claim on that lake's water rights. And not surprisingly, riparian water rights are very much connected to places that have more water than need. More water than need. That river's never going to run out. That lake is giant and is not going to get used up. So as long as there's property connected to a water source, you're sharing that water source. In some riparian systems, there is like a hierarchy. Oftentimes, like if you have a lot more property next to a river than someone else, you have more water rights. But for the most part, just generically think riparian water rights are very much embedded in property next to water sources. You don't trade water rights. It's just if you want to buy more water rights, you buy the piece of property. That's what the East Coast follows because that's where the people who landed on the East Coast were from. Places that had riparian water rights.
I have a question. So, for people on the East Coast, like, where were the major countries?
Don't worry about it. But England, France, places that had a lot of water. As we move across the United States, and as the United States now becomes a nation, and begins settling the rest of the, bless you guys, across the country, taking land, stealing land, acquiring land, gaining land, however you're comfortable thinking about that or not comfortable thinking about that, we move into drier and drier climates. And riparian water rights don't work as well in places where there's not enough water for everyone. Right? We start seeing that as the United States settles the Louisiana Purchase. Places like Texas. And then, of course, territory we grab from Mexico and so forth. There are other places in Europe that don't have enough water that falls from the sky either. A very good example of this is Spain. Spain's a pretty dry place. So a lot of countries in the Mediterranean region that have also been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, have their own series of water rights, and they're known as prior appropriative rights. Prior appropriative rights. They're very different than riparian water rights, prior appropriative rights. Basically, prior appropriative rights can be summed up in a very American expression. Of course, we have to take centuries of water policy and just create a colloquial expression. That's very American. First in time, first and right. First in time, first and right. Prior appropriative rights, I think, can best be summed up as first in time, first and right. Whoever's there first gets the water. What if there's people there before you? Boom, 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 I'm here first. Of course that would never happen, right? Prior appropriative rights is very much about showing up and grabbing water rights for public use, which also includes private activity. And when more people show up, there is a sequence of who gets water. Now, you can't show up and say, all of this water's mine. Part of prior appropriative rights is you have to be using the water productively. Right? Crops are fine. Personal consumption is good. Mining and other activities, totally fine. You can't just hoard it. You have to show that you're using it. If you're using all the water and you're not using it just to kind of store it, the government's like, you don't get to have all that water rights. So one other thing about prior appropriative rights is there is a sequence of who gets water priorities. If you show up later, you're not going to have as much water rights as other people. The second thing about prior appropriative rights is you can sell your water rights to someone else without selling property. Water purchases and water rights are very much transferable in a commercial sense in a way that they would never be riparian ones. Yeah, you could probably buy some water from someone else on the East Coast. Obviously that happens. But if you're talking about water rights on the East Coast, you're going to have to buy that property. In Western states, in states that often have a Spanish or Mexican history of water policy, you're going to be able to sell your water rights and still retain your land. Maybe you decide to stop being a rancher and sell your water to other people and still claim your land for other activities. If you take a more complicated class on this, one, I'm sorry, it gets really complicated, right? Two, let's go back to the first point. I'm sorry, I really am. There is the reality that it's much more nuanced than even that. We're going to say for this class, I know it's not 100% true, yeah, come at me later on, California is a prior appropriative right state. Are we exactly, sometimes we're called a hybrid state, you didn't hear that from me. East Coast states are riparian states, West Coast states are prior appropriative states. California is a good example of that. And what that leads to is people who were here first have more senior water rights than other people. And it also means over time, people who have money will buy people who've been here for a long time their water rights. That both solves some problems and creates new problems. That should probably be the t-shirt for government. Right? Solve some problems, creates new problems. So questions on riparian water rights versus prior appropriative water rights.
You said east is riparian?
Yeah? Right? And we can go back to our precipitation map. Places where there's enough water for everyone are places that follow riparian water rights because there's not really conflict over how much water is being used. Places where there's not enough water that falls to have much economic activity are places that are going to have real different policies when it comes to limited water or how you handle water. Every now and then I'll read an article about, because water is changing in the world and climate's changing in the world. Places that used to have enough water don't have as much water. Maybe there's been a surge in population or a change in agriculture. And those places that have riparian rights are like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? We don't have policies to handle limited water. And then like in the article it'll say like, well, there's other places in America and the world that have policies. Like, yeah. You could look that up on the internet in 10 seconds. But, if you're used to a certain policy and politics, that can be a big change. Mm-hmm. All right.
Oh, thank you. Is it in any state split by the wet parts of the states have riparian, the dry parts have prior appropriation?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's why some places are called hybrid.
Yeah, I was looking at Washington.
Right.
That seems like a very strong
And Washington's a great example of that, where the initial population is very much on the West Coast. There's tons of water, and it's settled by people from East Coast America, and they're like riparian, right? And then you go to the middle part of Washington where all those great apples are and other agriculture, and there's not enough water that falls from the sky because it's on the shadow side of the Cascade, and they're like, what are we going to do? And the answer is they're going to have to develop some kind of water appropriative rights in an area where the riparian rules don't apply. So absolutely. But I bet you that it gets really difficult in agriculture in Washington when the state runs riparianly, but that part of the state that's very small population-wise doesn't. In a way where even the population in California has to follow prior appropriative rights because there's not enough water that falls from the sky for our cities. So we're like, yeah, we get you, farms. We're doing the same thing. We're buying someone else's water. Sometimes we'll put buying in quotes. And we'll get to that. Question? Any other question? That's right. You were so nice to let him go first, or you thought he was first. Your question.
Oh, I was pointing to get my notes.
Oh, okay. You're just like, hey, someone had a question.
Yeah.
How nice. If I had a gummy bear, I'd give it to you. But I love gummy bears so much, I wouldn't have an extra gummy bear. Yes.
Last question. For the different parts of California,
Yes.
do you want to mark them down by county?
No. Yikes. No, please don't do that. That's too much extra work. I want you to know California is a prior appropriative right, and I want you to understand why we are based on the difference between prior appropriative rights and riparian rights. Okay? And again, you want to be thinking this from the framework of a multiple choice question, not a paragraph answer. You're welcome. So the first day of class I showed you in 1900, California was a lot smaller population-wise. LA had about 100,000 people in 1900. Not a number you need to know for a test. And I said that's about the maximum amount of people who could live in the city of Los Angeles based on the limited amount of water that exists in the LA River and the LA metropolitan surrounding environment, right? And as oil takes off in California, Southern California in particular, and as the movie industry takes off in Southern California, and as housing takes off in California because the climate's so wonderful, people begin arriving in California, and there's not enough water in Southern California, LA. So LA knows to expand, we're going to need to grab water from some other place. And so they kind of get charmed by this Irish immigrant named William Mulholland, who is a self-taught engineer, and says, we can buy water rights from parts of the mountain regions of California, and then using a gravity-fed aqueduct system, bring the water to Los Angeles. And they're like, isn't that going to be expensive? And the answer is very, very expensive. About $700 million in today's time for a city that's 100,000 people, a series of bonds. So imagine a huge amount of money to people whose economy is just slowly taking off, but everyone realizes that's going to be a way for Los Angeles to expand and begin flexing real economic might, is taking water. Right? So there's an area to the east of the Sierra Nevada, but still in California, because the Sierra Nevada just kind of curves down here. These are called the White Mountains, by the way. And there's this wonderful valley that exists, and I'll get to your hand in a little bit later, that everyone said was gorgeous. They said, it looked like Switzerland. It was beautiful, and there was trees, and there was grass, and there were farms, and there was this natural lake. And there wasn't a lot of people there, though. There was some agriculture, and it was gorgeous, but there wasn't a lot of people there. And so that's where Mulholland targeted acquiring water. So the LA Department of Water and Power begins this secret campaign to buy up, because of prior appropriative rights, water rights for people in that region. Right? A lot of times letting people keep a certain amount of water for their own personal use, but taking a lot of their water. Totally legal. Sometimes not doing it publicly because farmers don't like to hear other farmers' waters being bought and sold. That freaks people out for obvious reasons. And then sometimes a little pressure was put on farmers who are reluctant, and sometimes farmers fought back by doing some kind of horrible things. If you've ever seen the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, that's like a very Hollywood version of what happened. Chinatown's very much about water being acquired illegally, semi-legally, legally from Owens Valley. The water's acquired, this giant aqueduct system is built, the largest municipal water project ever constructed up until that point, in the early 1900s. Entirely gravity-fed. You've seen it if you've been to Los Angeles and drive the I-5 north. At a certain point, you're like, what's this weird thing going down the mountain? Looks like water. It is water. That's the Los Angeles Aqueduct. And the very famous ceremony in November 1913 in the basically dry San Fernando Valley, where farmers hope to have this excess water and begin planting all these crops. Someone releases a thing, the water flows on, and Mulholland tells the public and the media, there it is, take it. A very early American way of thinking about resources. And LA does. One of the reasons why LA expands massively in this time period is they can go to cities and say, we have water, why don't we annex you, and you'll have water. And some places like Hollywoodland and Venice are like, we really need water. Sure. What's the price? Oh, you're not going to like the price. But you need water. Yeah, we need water. And in some places like Beverly Hills are like, we have these natural springs around here. No, get lost. We're fine. Beverly Hills, not rich, not wealthy, not influential. It just has its own supply of water. So it's like, get lost, LA. And then LA grows around it, and people are like, hey, I'm not part of LA. That's good. I want to live there. And then develop huge, giant mansions in the area as LA is expanding economically as well. So LA just grows and grows and grows because it has the only source of water in this region because it has this giant aqueduct taking water from the Sierra Nevada. Eventually, it runs out of water. It builds a giant aqueduct to the Colorado River. Eventually, it reaches the max it can take under compacts and treaties. There's a lake north of Owens River Valley, known as Mono Lake. Mono Lake is this weird place. It's a salt lake. It is gorgeous. Like you get some crazy photos of Mono Lake. You can look it up on your phone sometime. Nothing lives around there. No one really wants to be around there because it's the middle of nowhere. And some fresh streams feed into Mono Lake. Mono Lake itself is salt water. And so LA begins taking that fresh water, buying it up. And this is like in the 1960s and 70s. And eventually, like the Sierra Club and environmental groups are like, enough. You can't just take all the water in the planet and build it into your LA aqueduct system. And they go to court and they say, this is not a good public use of water. You're going to suck this lake dry and cause huge environmental damage. By the way, you've already done that to Owens Lake, that's now completely dry and has massive dust storms. And so courts begin for the first time ever siding with the environmental movement and saying, part of the prior appropriative right is this public consumption, is this productive need, and LA is like, could easily curb water use by conserving more, so it's not proving that it needs this excess water, and it begins the pendulum swinging back the other way. So they take some water from Mono Lake. It's a very complicated compact. They also put a thin 1 or 2 inches of water on Owens Lake now, so there's not dust storms. Like you can walk across here, like, hey, look, I'm walking across water. Like, no, you're not. You're walking across 1 inch of water. Congratulations. My friend has a photo. I wanted to show it in class. He refused to let other people see it. So I honored his request. But fundamentally, LA Aqueduct, a local municipal water aqueduct, fundamentally changes the state as it acquires water from other places and ships it purely by gravity, no electronics necessary, into Los Angeles and the Los Angeles basin. You had a question a while back.
Oh, I was just, the Owens Valley, that's like, you addressed it.
Mm-hmm.
It's poisonous.
Yeah, it's not so good.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions?
Just a follow-up. Poisonous?
I mean, it's highly unhealthful. Let's say that.
They dry, it's all
The
dried out.
the measures of the different levels of things that go into lungs is very high there because of the wind and the lack of any vegetation or
It
water.
used to be covered by water, and then the water's gone, and now it's, I forget, it starts with an A.
Archaeobacteria? Is that what it
No,
is?
it's like, it's a type of poison.
Probably higher levels of arsenic than are allowed.
See, starts with an A.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Poison is probably a little too much, extremely unhealthful. We wouldn't want to hang out there. Probably a little more accurate.
Well, arsenic is
Well,
poisonous, so
my
it
device is
fits.
that arsenic is a
Alcohol is poisonous, but we consume that. Right? Everything is poisonous. Coffee is poisonous, apparently. But I'm not stopping that.
No, I'm not stopping it either.
They can take it from my dead hands, right? And maybe they will, because it's poison. Let's not go down that road. But yeah, this is the story of Los Angeles water. But don't worry. Noble, pristine, liberal, progressive, wonderful San Francisco would never have a horrible water story either. Everything they do is holier than thou and wonderful and good, right? San Francisco elevates the game by directly stealing water from Yosemite National Park. None of this we're going to build this municipal thing and hoodwink farmers out of their water. We're going to go straight to the source and in the early 1900s say, hey, we're one of the top largest cities in the country. We are the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. We are the major port on the Pacific as the United States is looking west. We need to grow and be powerful. The United States, you need to let us happen. We demand that you change federal law and allow us to tap water from Yosemite. And Congress said, sure. I don't know about this. This seems like a bad idea. Cool. Let's do it. They start by in 1901 on a giant oak tree on the Tuolumne River on this giant plank saying, we plan to take this water for city use. Because part of prior appropriative rights is publicly stating, we want this water. They're like, this is our water, we're claiming it. And so they do, right? Then they convince Congress to change federal law so they can begin to take water from Yosemite National Park by building a giant reservoir off one of the rivers, Merced River in Yosemite. Hatch, which is the name of the valley. Gorgeous. Gorgeous. Like Yosemite Valley level gorgeous. John Muir felt that it was more beautiful than Yosemite, but it was harder to get to, so it didn't get as much publicity. And he and the Sierra Club fought the city of San Francisco on this, and then just did not have the political firepower. I had to look really hard to find an ugly picture now. It's still really beautiful.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. If that was like a natural lake, you'd be like, holy shit, that's amazing. Right? It's not. It's a valley covered up with water because we have a giant dam that blocks it up. Right? Yeah.
Okay, so the first picture was with it without.
Without it. That was an
before
old timey picture. I didn't like use one of your filters on your phones, right? That'd be great if I did that. No. It was a photo before they dammed it up.
Okay. This is.
This is, we'll say now, it's a few years ago, right? You can't walk around it. You used to after 9/11, right? They're like, we don't want people touching water supplies, no. So like there used to be like a hiking trail around it. It's harder to do that now. But this is a gorgeous valley underwater, so the people of San Francisco can have water. And it produces a lot of water. I mean, crazy amounts. 2.4 million people in San Francisco and the Bay Area are supplied by the water in this lake, in this reservoir every year, as it gets shipped down. Let me just show you exactly what I'm talking about here. There's before and after. Before it totally filled in, right? An absolutely gorgeous valley that San Francisco uses political might to dam it up so we can have access to fresh, clean water. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we know how the Los Angeles County, they built.
City,
yes.
Mhm.
How they were able to build it up and like convince all these people. They're expanded and all of this stuff because of the aqueduct that they built.
Yes.
Do you think that San Francisco has been more successful because of this reservoir than Los Angeles was?
That's probably a normative question I'm not comfortable answering, like who did it better, right? I will say in LA's defense, LA taxed themselves, right? And then bought the water, right? San Francisco taxed themselves to build the system, but gets the water for free. Right? Now, that's not entirely fair. They do pay $30,000 a year for all the water a year. Because that was set in 1918, and inflation wasn't a thing then.
It's San Francisco pays the 30.
Yeah, San Francisco. I mean, probably the San Francisco Joint Water Development for the peninsula. Right? Also, San Francisco produces millions of dollars a year because this gravity-fed system generates water turbines that produce electricity. So like the entire city of San Francisco government is, its electricity is generated by the aqueduct system. Mm-hmm.
This is purely speculative. What
Okay.
would happen if the aqueduct, dries up? What happens to, like, if the...
The Sierra Club's view is that the reservoir should be drained, the dam destroyed, there'd be 2 million people without water in the Bay Area.
And you were just talking just a second ago about that also supplying power, right?
It does.
That
The
would
power would be
be-
gone, which is not an immense amount, but it's good for the city because it means they don't have to pay money to buy electricity. But the big issue would be where you find 2 million, water for 2 million people.
There is no other solution. Is
No.
there? So, sorry, Sierra Club.
My impression of the Sierra Club is they don't like when people say that to them.
I mean, I say that with all due respect.
Yeah. That might help a little bit. They still probably are still annoyed.
Necessary evil.
That's always
That's a first step to bad things.
I mean, not necessary evil. When San Francisco was created, it's not like they were. They weren't doing planning into, you know.
They needed the water.
Yeah.
National parks were new things. The idea of tapping water that wasn't being used is a very normal system, particularly in prior appropriative rights. They claimed the water, no one challenged them on that, and they got Congress to pass a law to let them do it. They're not breaking any rule, right? In hindsight, we're like, that probably wasn't the best way to do things. In hindsight, holy crap. 15 semesters of classes on, we shouldn't have done that. And we'd be barely scratching the surface. But it's important to understand water history in California is built on grabbing water from some other place.
Is there anywhere else in the world that has as mitigated a water system as California?
Probably not, because of our prior appropriative rules and the way water falls.
Okay.
Most places would be like, there's not enough water for people or crops there, don't move there.
One last question.
Mm-hmm.
If there was a large enough earthquake, would the majority of us just be totally screwed?
Well, I mean, one of the things that happens is we have giant reservoirs to give us 6 months, year and a half supply of water until they fix the thing.
Okay.
If it's a big enough earthquake like in a movie where everything's destroyed,
Well, I
no one
mean,
cares about that at that
Yeah,
point.
well, that was wrong anyway. Like
Right.
the way that the San Andreas,
Yeah.
it goes.
Which is basically like right around here.
Yeah, it goes
I'm
right
sure
through
that
San
will never-
Andreas
it'll-
Lake.
it'll never go
Like,
off.
the way
That-
the San
we'll be
Andreas
fine.
Fault is it's like this. It's not like a subductive.
It will do serious damage to Hetchy,
Okay.
and it would have to be repaired.
All right.
I was gonna say, so when it was originally built, there was still a lot of agriculture in the Bay Area, right?
That's right.
And so I know agriculture tends to use a lot more.
A lot more,
so,
right? 80-20 water use in California, as we already have learned.
So,
Yeah, a lot of that water went to agricultural use in the Bay
Yeah,
Area,
I was-
right?
I was gonna say,
The
that's
walnut
probably-
trees of Silicon Valley, before they became, Silicon Valley. All right, CVP, Central Valley Project. We're now in the 1930s. We are in a Great Depression. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people pouring into California because of the Dust Bowl that's hitting Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas and Arkansas. They're coming into California, they're penniless. They have nothing. And the idea is maybe we can have them go to the Central Valley and start working in an industry that they have a lot of familiarity with, agriculture. The problem is the Central Valley, which can grow pretty much anything, particularly the San Joaquin in the south, doesn't have enough natural water to produce serious agriculture. So the idea is, what if the federal government begins to dam the Sacramento River and create a water source and then ship that water south into the San Joaquin to provide water for agriculture? And people said, well, we could engineerily do that, but it would be really expensive. And the federal government said, during the period of the Roosevelt administration, let's do that. And so the federal government passes legislation and begins a process of creating a federal, I want you to write that part down, a federal water system to provide water for agriculture. And I want you to write that down. And I'd love you to underline the two things: CVP, federal agriculture. CVP, federal agriculture. CVP, federal agriculture. Yes. CVP, federal agriculture. I'm happy to say it 10 more times. CVP, federal agriculture. No, I know. What are you actually asking me to repeat?
Like, before that,
Uh-huh.
the sentence you said.
The federal government created a water system to send water from Northern California to Southern California for agricultural use. And so it creates a giant lake. You've probably heard of it. Lake Shasta. That takes water that would normally go down the Sacramento River and saves it up for the summertime and then releases it through the Sacramento River, and then it reaches the Sacramento Delta, and then giant pumps begin to push the water the other way through the San Joaquin Valley, and then delivering that water to different water districts across the San Joaquin Valley to grow agricultural crops to provide work for all of the Okies, which is the derogatory term we use for people who moved to California in the 1930s. Right? You guys have probably read Steinbeck at some point, right? There you go. Boom. He's talking a lot about that stuff, right? Grapes of Wrath
My family was Okies.
and Dubious Battle, right? I read that stuff too, right? And so that's part of that history of California is these groups coming, who are mistreated, who are considered other, who are the outcasts, who happen to be white, but they're not considered white in some cases, and are the agricultural labor for building up the Central Valley, brought to you by the federal government, spending money to build up a giant water system to provide water for agriculture. By the way, it also includes, as you can see here, this is entirely the CVP system, Folsom Dam. The other component of CVP is, man, California has a lot of wild rivers that seem to flood all the time. We should probably dam them so they stop flooding things. Well, the American River, man, that thing floods all the time. Let's build a giant dam, not really for water distribution for other parts of the state, just to kind of hold the water back so we don't flood Sacramento and all of those cities all the time. So the Folsom Dam was built primarily for water control. And then at that time, everyone's like, oh, also create a really fun lake people can do things in and recreation. All right. And then not really considering like, oh, that water could be used for other purposes. For the most part, it's not. It is used for like local areas to use the water for water use, but it's really not part of the like Lake Shasta system of water going south for agriculture. CVP, federal agriculture.
And you said it was two parts of that? I'm sorry.
Did I say it was two parts?
CVP, the other part was the dam and rivers? So
It's creating lakes and reservoirs of water for agricultural use in the San Joaquin Valley. And one of the most famous of them, as you can see, not all of them, is Lake Shasta. Right? A man-made lake in the northern part of the state by damming the Sacramento River. Part of what's interesting about California water is our success stories, and these are all success stories to varying degrees, but also our water failures. And I think the biggest water failure in California history has to be the Salton Sea. Way down here at the very bottom of the state. So here's the story of the Salton Sea. No one lives in this part of the state for much of California history. Even Indian groups tend to avoid it. It's desert, it's hot, it's horrible. Nothing lives there. Nothing wants to live there. All right? But the Imperial Valley, which is an area right in here, is extremely dry and hot, even in the wintertime, and will grow anything in the winter, including things like lettuce, including things like oranges, including things like vegetables and fruits. And people begin to realize, in the winter I don't like to can things and eat canned food. I like fresh food. Can't we just have places and with these rail cars move fresh food? Well, you'd have to build an entire infrastructure or something. Let's do that. Well, that's going to have huge costs and let's do that. I'm wealthy, let's do that. So, a bunch of people move to the Imperial Valley and begin the process of creating an agricultural system. There's no water there, but right nearby is the giant Colorado River. If we can take some of that water from the river, and there's so much water there, we're fine, and build an aqueduct into the Imperial Valley, we'll have more than enough water to begin creating an agricultural base for winter vegetables, and that will produce a lot of money. The problem is, in 1905, as they're building the aqueduct, they lose control of the Colorado River, and it begins emptying into the Imperial Valley.
Yeah.
All of it. Oops. Like, oops, all berries, Captain Crunch, right? Like, oops. Now, this giant area, the Salton Sea, doesn't exist at this point. It's actually known as the Salton Sink. It's an area that in prehistoric time was a giant lake that had long been dried out for tens of thousands of years, below sea level. Just this hot, dry, dusty place that no one got near because it was horrible. It's a perfect place to collect water. And as the Colorado River empties into the Salton Sink, it fills up into a giant, beginning to be fresh water, quickly turning into a saltwater lake. Now, first of all, Mexico's not particularly happy that there's no more Colorado River. Right? They're like, we have treaties and stuff, and this isn't going so well. Of course, this is also a period, like many periods in Mexico, where they're going through like a revolution or a revolution on a revolution, and that's causing chaos too. But they're not happy. No one else is happy either, because they're like, what happens when the Salton Sea completely fills up? Where is it going to spill next? Like, there's no magic place this spills out. Is it going to go someplace else? Is it going to spill into Mexico, someplace it didn't want? So, the farmers and engineers that are working on this aqueduct have to turn to the giant railroad, the Southern Pacific Railroad, and use their expertise and a lot of dynamite, and they force the river back into its natural course. We succeed in putting the Colorado River back on its natural course. You know, the river is the boundary between Arizona and California. It is a federal treaty between the United States and Mexico. So we kind of have to do that. Eventually they figure out how to create a new canal that doesn't shift the entire Colorado River later on, which is why Imperial Valley exists as an agricultural place today. But now we have this new interesting scenario of this giant saltwater sea in the middle of California that didn't exist before. And for probably 20 or 30 years, the answer was like, who cares? It's a big state. We got other things going on. There's a giant saltwater sea. Of course, we're California. We should have everything. Tall trees, saltwater seas, freshwater lakes, mountains. Like, we're just adding to our stuff, right? We'll eventually just take the, Eiffel Tower and move it over here, too. Las Vegas beat us to it, right? In, like, the post-World War II period, as California is expanding, the Salton Sea becomes like a kind of hip, happening, middle-class resort community. Like, hey, come out from LA or San Diego and come out in, the wintertime or the springtime to Salton Sea. It's nice temperature, it's not too hot yet. You can go, on this new thing and go water skiing and hang out. And so it becomes popular. But the problem is, without the giant water coming in anymore, the Salton Sea begins to contract, as it did tens of thousands of years ago once it lost its source of water. And it got saltier and saltier. All the fish died in it. It became nasty. A lot of the fish, a lot of the birds that would fly over the Salton Sea and land there, moving because all the rest of the coastal lands had been filled up with housing. Those birds start dying. This still happens every year. It's really horrible in that time of year when it occurs. The resort communities dry up. And now you have a much smaller Salton Sea with huge areas of dust storms that spread up and send chemicals to all sorts of population, including Palm Springs. So pretty much every gubernatorial administration in the last 40 years has basically done this. I'm running for governor. I promise I'll clean up the Salton Sea. I'm elected governor. I have 10,000 things to do. No one cares about the Salton Sea. Midway through my term, oh, that's right, there's the Salton Sea. We should do something about it. Then, holy crap, where do I get fresh water to fix the Salton Sea? It's all being used for other people. Oh, that's right, there's 10,000 things to do. Salton Sea gets worse. New governor candidate, I promise to fix the Salton Sea. It's almost as if governors of different parties and different ideologies just take their predecessor's book as the running for governor and say, I'm going to do this. And then I don't do that. And then the next person's like, I'm going to do this. And one of the real reasons is not because they're so distracted. Governors can do more than one thing at once. They have staff. It's that the only way to give water to the Salton Sea, which is really the easiest and best way to fix the problem, means taking water from someone else. San Diego, the farmers in Imperial Valley, other states that use the Colorado River, a separate country, Mexico. None of those are good solutions, and they only could happen with massed amounts of money. Which then means the state of California has to take money that could be used for other projects, like us, CSU, and give it to buy water for the Salton Sea.
I thought the new plan was to pull lithium out of the area.
There is talk, because it turns out that that bed has been dry for so long that there is some potential lithium under there, which we need for all our fancy batteries. But
New plan.
that's like, hey, we can use private money from lithium mining to help pay to buy the water.
I'm pretty sure Berkshire Hathaway has their little fingers.
I'm sure there's a lot of people who have their fingers and stuff out there, right? Also, there's always this idea of we'll convince the federal government to give us money too. And the federal government's always like, ha ha ha, oh, wait, you're serious? No, go away.
I mean, how much worse could a primary industry be?
I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars,
I'm just saying.
right? So, oftentimes decisions we make when it comes to water continues to be an issue even after we've kind of fixed the immediate problem, and that's kind of part of the complexity of water in California. Questions on the Salton Sea?
This is a really good movie.
It was a little too cinematic forte for me, I guess. But, yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about agriculture for a second. California is the world's 5th largest supplier of food and agricultural commodities in the world. Right? America's number 1, but removing California from America, we would be ranked 5th in agricultural product. We've been easily the number 1 agricultural state since 1948. So basically the entire post-World War II period, even up to today, California ranks first in agricultural product among all the states. Number 1 agricultural county in the country, California, Fresno County. Fresno County has been number 1 for several decades. In fact, the top 5 agricultural counties in product in the United States are California, all of them in the Central Valley. Bless you. Fresno County's agricultural output would make it larger than 23 states' agricultural product. Not 23 combined, but 23 different states. Would you need to know that for a test? No. Should you know Fresno State's number 1 agricultural county in the country? Yeah. It's not that hard to type Fresno, agricultural product, but it might take a little bit of work, and so in which case, you've written it down. You're in good shape. California produces more than 350 different commercial agricultural products. We grow more than half of the nation's fruits, vegetables, and nuts. California grows more than 1/3 of all of the vegetables in the United States. Here's a list of stuff that California produces that you can only find grown in California for the United States. Other places in the world will grow these things too. Almonds, artichokes, dates, figs, grapes, kiwi fruit, olives, persimmons, pomegranates, dried plums, raisins, clingstone peaches, pistachios, sweet rice, walnuts. Other places in the world grow those things, but if you wanted them to be only American made, that's only made in California or grown here. But, this comes at a cost. The story really isn't of the water used in California, 80% agriculture and 20% is people. It's that about 40% of all of the water in California is used by agriculture. About 10% is people. And then about the other 50% is a combination of different natural water sources. You can't use up all the water in California or all the rivers run dry. All the creatures that provide on them die. The health of the state deteriorates. So there has to be a balance between us drinking water to live, crops needing water for economic and output and food, and then the natural use for water. And one of the things the government has to do is balance these different competing interests. Right, one of the examples of this that I think the government does poorly is you will constantly hear during drought all the things you should do to conserve water. Right? Take fewer showers or not as long. Don't flush as often, which is like, yikes, right? Don't water as much outside, which probably is true. We don't need to have like this beautifully landscaped garden, right? We should do all these things for 10%. Right? How about this? How about not grow as many almond trees, which take huge amounts of water? Well, almond trees produce a lot of money. Okay. Wonderful. Other great thing about almond trees, once you plant them, they have about 30 years of productive economic activity. You have to give them the same amount of water for 30 years. Other crops are like, oh, this is a bad year for water. Let's not grow as many watermelons. Let's cut back on this. The problem with trees is once you economically plant them, you're on the hook for a lot more years. One of the things the Imperial Valley produces a lot of agriculturally is alfalfa, which is used for cows. Right? Maybe weirdos who have alfalfa for their sandwiches, right? But no, cows. Right? I have tried it. It's horrible.
It's delicious.
Yeah.
I know how you feel. I've had sprouts on a sandwich. Yuck!
Yeah, it doesn't work, right? I respect people for liking things that are different than me, but I also don't. But we use this to grow, to help, for cattle feed. The other thing is, we produce it so well in Imperial Valley, we use it for cattle feed in other nations. We ship alfalfa to other parts of the world because the alfalfa content is really good. You're getting beyond my scientific level, right? Somehow the alfalfa is extra alfalfa than other alfalfas, right? And that's probably a technical term, so it's okay. But what that means is we're taking valuable water and shipping it so it can be used other places, right? Meanwhile, make sure you shower with someone else, which, might be good, might not be good. I'll leave that to you. Let's not have that conversation, right? So oftentimes it's like, because there are real things that can easily be done to reduce this, the focus is on this, even though this is where real issues of water can come in very quickly. On the other hand, reducing agricultural output, one, means less food, right? Agricultural output's a fun way of saying food. And then two, it can be devastating to communities that once they get below critical mass, feed stores close, tractor stores close, they don't come back. So there's cost to that. This might be a little easier than this long term, even though you're not getting as much gallons of water for the deal if you're working on agriculture. By the way, agriculture produces less than 2% of the state's economic output per year. You heard me right, 2%. All the billions that we produce and the powerhouse that California is agriculturally is a rounding error compared to the massive economic might of the state. I don't know, I should have a cue, but I'm not that smart. We'll say yes.
All right. How much of those agricultural products are only grown in California because it's the only climate it will grow in versus it's like the best yields,
Yeah.
the best
Yes.
economics?
Yes.
Because
That's my answer.
Yeah.
Right? So, a little bit of A, a little bit of B.
Yeah.
Right? You probably could force artichokes to grow in New York State, and you would lose a lot of money.
Yeah, it's like
Right? Now, if you call them artisanal, right, maybe you'd be okay. I don't know. But it wouldn't taste very good. I'll tell you that. But yes, some of that is because of the ease of growing stuff.
Yeah.
Part of that also, though, is that some of the climates in other parts of the country, you couldn't grow that stuff.
Yeah, I just always find it weird that it's like all the places where we have lots of water, we're just growing like corn, or we're not even growing anything. It's
Yeah,
like, it
well,
seems
sometimes
like
because there's not water in that area.
yeah.
But it's a good point. Other hands I saw raised or have been answered. Yes?
Isn't there like a whole thing about like how Nestle has like a huge part of like the usable water in California. They bottle it up and ship it everywhere.
There are these interesting, lengthy old compacts that keep on existing even after sometimes the compact should have been renewed. I couldn't tell you a lot about Nestle. I've read some things. There's this case in Southern California where like Arrowhead Water had this contract to extract a certain amount of water from a national forest, and they were doing quadruple the amount, and that pact ended 30 years ago. They just, no one told us to stop. And we're like, yeah, you should update that and pay more. And they're like, hey, no one told us to stop, so we're going to no, stop until no one's telling us to stop. I'm telling you to stop. No. And eventually the federal government's like, you have to stop, or we will take away your factory. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we'll stop now because someone told us to stop. And that the state's been telling you to stop. Well, I don't hear the state.
Yeah, you just ignored it.
Yeah. All right. State water plan, state water project. Sometimes I've heard, that's okay. It's actually state water plan. SWP. So, CVP, federal agriculture. CVP, federal agriculture. SWP, state water for people. SWP, state water for people. One more time, the SWP is a state-run program that moves water for human consumption. California is massively growing after World War II, as we already talked about. Most of that growth is in Southern California. There's not a lot of water in Southern California. And people are moving to areas that are not just the city of Los Angeles. This book you've read, or you will read in this class, Holy Land, is a suburb of Los Angeles. It is not the city of Los Angeles, the city of Lakewood. And there are dozens of those suburbs, eventually hundreds of those suburbs in Southern California. How are they going to get their water? Sometimes there's natural springs. Most of the time there's not. Or if there are, they need to be augmented by additional water. And so the Pat Brown administration, that's Jerry Brown's dad, who was also governor of the state. The Pat Brown administration says what we need to do is build a complementary system to the CVP to move water from Northern California to Southern California, but this time to provide water for the growing population, not for agriculture. It's immediately controversial. Northern California is like, you're going to steal our water. Well, first of all, it's for the state of California people. You're stealing our water. Well, we're just moving water from Northern California. You're stealing our water. Oh, calm down. All right? But the other problem with the state WP, other than just simply natural, this is our water, is like the CVP, it's going to store water in Northern California. That's where the water falls. It's going to create a secondary giant lake, Lake Oroville, rather than the Shasta Lake, and move the water south through the Sacramento River, through the Sacramento Delta, or the San Joaquin Delta as it's often called, and then pump it to Southern California, going past the Central Valley into Southern California where the population is. One of the deals they make with the federal government is they'll share joint ownership of the giant canal, and they'll expand it and make it bigger. You can see the canal if you've ever driven on the Interstate 5 going south. It's called the Pat Brown Canal now, but it's also officially called the California Aqueduct. And part of that is called the Cal-Fed Canal because both the federal and state government share it, but then eventually this becomes state canal lake going forward. So one of the issues is the delta. The delta, as we've talked about, is this really interesting inverse delta. It's a very abnormal thing around the planet. Water goes out in only one area. And the issue is, well, how do you get water from the north to the south because it's going to naturally go to the bay? You've got to build giant pumps that suck the water backwards into basically the San Joaquin River, into the canal, to then gravity move the water southward. Right? And that causes all sorts of weirdness to the canal because you're naturally moving water the incorrect way. So environmentalists didn't like that. They're like, this is not a good idea. Northern California didn't like this. They're like, we don't want to lose our water. It's like, is it your water? Yes, it's ours. Okay, calm down. And so this goes in front of voters as a giant, big, statewide bond project. Barely passes. And builds a giant SWP program. Some agricultural uses used from the SWP. In my notes, 70% municipal water use, 30% agricultural use. You would not need to know that. That adds complexity that we don't need, right? We need CVP, federal, agriculture, SWP, people use, state. We're okay with that. Because I'm sure there's some CVP use that ends up helping some towns and villages or something somewhere. But the CVP is primarily agricultural water. The SWP is overwhelmingly, for municipal water government and ultimately for public consumption. Yes?
Does this have to do with the Save the Delta type of?
We'll get to the Save the Delta. We'll get there. It does, absolutely.
This is gonna get interesting.
Yeah. So are we all clear on this part? Yes.
So, on the map, right, there's the light blue, do we have to know the different parts of the lake?
No. We do not. CVP, federal, agriculture, SW. I say this, 30% of you will still get it wrong. Right? So I'm saying it many times because I want to go to only 15% of you get it wrong. Right? I'm hoping for a new world order here, right? But that's the level of complexity I want you to understand between the CVP and the SWP. I might ask a question that's a little more nuanced, a little more complicated, but as long as you keep that in mind in your notes, you'll be able to work your way through the question. I'm not interested in exactly the difference between Lake Shasta and Lake Orville. You should know that in a general sense if you read about it in the news, not in a testing sense for this class. There's a whole class on California water where I'm sure you'd have to know that stuff. Yes?
But a part of the SWP is that they took water from NorCal and moved it for SoCal.
And that's the same as CVP.
Okay.
That part is exactly the same. Who runs the program and what that water is used for, that's where we diverge.
Got it.
But yes, you're getting the sense that they're both doing the same thing. Yes?
Maybe you just said this, my bad. But SWP and CVP, they're mostly for the Central Valley? Or are they?
The SWP also will include water to San Diego and all the municipalities around Los Angeles.
And CVP not?
CVP only goes to the Central Valley.
It's agricultural only.
Yeah. Jerry Brown, Pat Brown's son, in 1982, puts a measure on the ballot that would expand the SWP. Jerry Brown, Pat Brown's son, puts a measure on the ballot in 1982 that would expand the SWP. Basically, the Delta has become the big issue from the 60s until the 80s. Those pumps that are moving water backwards are having real environmental damage to the Delta. It's also creating imbalances between fresh water in the Delta and the salt water from the bay. You move too much fresh water through backwards, salt water intervenes and causes problems. Right? So no one's happy because the Southern California is growing and growing and the Central Valley is using more and more water. We're using the pumps more. So, the solution by the technical experts and endorsed by the Brown administration, the Jerry Brown 1.0 administration, is to build a peripheral canal. That is, to build a canal around the Delta, connecting the Sacramento River and then the California Aqueduct, but not using the Sacramento Delta, and therefore not using those pumps. It'd be about 50 miles, and it would go around the Sacramento Delta. You guys follow me? Good. No one likes this idea. No one likes this idea. Southern California doesn't like this idea because it's going to cost a lot of money, and there's a lot of Republicans at this period down in Southern California. And they're like, we don't want to pay the money for this. San Francisco continued with this legacy of anything that helps any other part of the state we don't like. Right? Northern California just has a general, don't steal our water. A lot of farmers in the Delta are like, we hate the pumps, this seems scarier than that. What we're really scared about is if there's a natural way to go around, natural being constructed, to go around the delta, what stops them from pumping even more water around? And then even more water is taken, and that could damage our farms, that could cause all sorts of problems. We don't like this, so no. Environmental groups are like, we hate what's happening to the delta, this seems worse. And so this kind of huge coalition of people in Southern California and Northern California are like, no. Oops, I just clicked this thing twice. No, I don't want to start the tour. This is a county map of the vote, Prop 9, for the peripheral canal. You can see the dark red counties are counties that voted 90% no. There are precincts in the Bay Area where they don't record a single yes vote. Right? And you can see Southern California supports it, but not super strongly. With a lot of opposition, people are like, I don't want to spend the money because it's going to be paid for by state money. And then a lot of ambiguous nature of the rest of the state. And so this fails. The peripheral canal fails. One more time so we're very clear, we do not build the peripheral canal. The peripheral canal fails. It's defeated 38 to 62%. 38 to 62%. I'll let you figure out what that measure would be if I asked about how much it failed by. I wouldn't ask a percentage. 38 to 62 could be significant. It could be substantial. It's not going to be tiny. It probably wouldn't be overwhelmingly. I'll let you figure out with a fun adjective that you write next to that what you think 3862 is. Yes.
So that's the second fail of the water.
This is the peripheral canal vote in 1982.
Right, and then we had the salt.
The Salton Sea is a different kind of failure. The Salton Sea is like, oops, water everywhere.
Okay, but
The peripheral canal is like, we don't want this.
Okay,
Jerry Brown 2.0, the old man who returns to save the state from the robot from the future that's saying to save the state, says, okay, we still need to do this. Because what happens is the delta gets worse. We don't build the peripheral canal. The delta gets worse. And a lot of environmental groups that were like, this is the devil, are like, oh shit, doing nothing was the devil. And so a lot of environmental groups and farmer groups come to the state and say, and you can imagine, they don't like saying this, we were wrong. They probably didn't say we were wrong. They probably used more fancy language to obfuscate the word we were wrong. You know, in hindsight, looking back on the series of things and what happened that we couldn't protect, maybe it's better to have some water source separate from pumping water through the delta. And so Jerry Brown 2.0 is like, I don't want to go through the peripheral canal again. That was a huge defeat. I look back. But he's like, there's intense pressure by farmers and by a lot of environmental groups, not all environmental groups, not all farmers, and a lot of Northern Californians, not all Northern Californians, who are like, we should think about a solution. And so the solution they came up with was a giant twin tunnel underneath the delta. Peripheral canal 2, never use the word peripheral canal. It's toxic in California politics. We'll call it an alternative water conveyance device. Bless you. So that was the proposal. Jerry Brown 2.0 is like, let's build these two giant tunnels. And then the second smart thing that Jerry Brown had us is like, we're not going to charge the state, because that ticks off people in the state. We're going to charge the water companies and the water districts in Central and Southern California that are going to use this water. Like, hey, you want the water? You can raise water rates. We're not going to charge the state. A lot of farmers, a lot of environmental groups, a lot of Northern Californians still say, no way. This is bullshit. No. And they are fighting it to the bitter end. Jerry Brown 2.0 is gone. Gavin Newsom comes into office. Where's Gavin Newsom from?
San Francisco.
San Francisco. He's like, I want to think more about this. I want to think more. I like this. I'm never going to go against Jerry Brown. But I want to think more about this. So let's build one tunnel rather than two tunnels. That way we can be considerate about it. But really the nice thing about building one tunnel is you have to start all over again with the permits. Everything starts over from scratch. All the environmental reports and whatnot. And what that really does is it kicks the can down the road until after Gavin Newsom is what?
President.
Governor, well, maybe. We'll see. Governor of California. So I don't know if we'll see a peripheral canal 2 or a peripheral tunnel, but I do know this, it's not going to happen on Gavin Newsom's watch, and he's not going to get the heat for it being built, because it's being reworked. So we'll see what happens. Meanwhile, the Delta continues to have problems. And the last photo I'll show you, and I know it's time to go. The Delta smell is a not very productive or commercial piece of fish in the Delta, but it's one of those kind of like special bio creatures that predicts the health of a region. Basically, it has ceased to exist in the Delta. We grow it in labs and pump it into the Delta, and then next year they're all gone. And then we grow them in labs again and pump them in. When the Delta smell is gone and other fish and birds begin to disappear, it'll be too late to fix the Delta. So these are real issues we're worrying about in the future, and we're still worrying about them. That's the complexity of California politics. And that should give us a good grounding as we move forward, we move into California political history. I'll see you guys next Monday. If you have any questions, let me know.